This is Your Own Best Company, a podcast for people who love to work alone. Hey there, everybody. Franklin Taggart here, and this is a solo edition of Your Own Best Company, a podcast for people who love working alone. I am one of you, and there's nothing finer in my life than a room with a door and time to spend with my tools and my imagination. And this is a podcast that celebrates and honors people like us who like those same things. The thing that I'd like to talk about today is it's an ongoing topic of discussion between me and my clients of all varieties. And that is, what are you being paid for? I think pricing comes up in, I want to say, if I were to put a percentage on it, I would guess close to 80% of the conversations that I have with business clients are around pricing and around the difficulty that they have coming up with what they feel like is a fair price, but is one that doesn't short sell anybody and doesn't leave anybody hanging. I think that there's a lot that goes into pricing that we can address to make it a little less daunting. And that's kind of the purpose of the podcast today. Now, I don't have a whole lot of structure to this. I do have some ideas that I'd like to talk about, but I'd like to start out with a couple of stories. I work a lot with people who are doing freelance work, a lot of people who are doing design, web design, copywriting, those kinds of creative services. And for most of them, there's some competition in the marketplace, that's about price and about having the lowest price, the greatest value for the lowest price, and things like that. But I usually want to talk to those folks about differentiating themselves from that market. And the reason for that is because it's like anybody who knows right now, you can go on Fiverr and get almost anything for, pretty much any price that you name. Or you can go on Upwork and you can see a whole range of prices for professional creative services that range anywhere from, $10 a page to, $10,000 a project for things like editing or things like design. And it's hard to find what works in those situations. So one of the things that I'd like to talk about today is to get through some of the deeply held sacred cows that we have around pricing, in terms of different beliefs that we have about pricing that I think need to be challenged. And then I really want to answer one question, that is, what are you being paid for? Because as I've learned all of the stuff that I've learned over the years, pricing boils down to that one thing. If you can clearly answer, what are you being paid for, in a satisfactory way, your pricing is going to make sense, both to you and to the person who's paying for it. Now, the story that I'd like to tell is about a designer that came to me recently. The designer had been offered a job with a firm, being paid an hourly rate that was significantly lower than what they would normally make as a freelancer. And we talked a little bit about that. And one of the things that was talked about there was that this designer, the company that was hiring this person, wanted to give away the design as a part of their offer. And I discouraged that. I said there are a couple of reasons why I discouraged that. And one of them is that, first of all, the perception of your work is not being valued. It's being put out there as an incentive instead of as a part of the value proposition. And I think that that's really important for us to distinguish, is that if we want our creative work to continue to retain some kind of value in the marketplace, at some point we have to take a stand and say, I'm not giving it away. This is not free. It's not free to me, and it shouldn't be free to you. And the value that it brings to the table is something that we really need to talk about. But so we had a really long discussion, and ultimately there were some things that we arrived at. First one is that as a freelance professional, I think that you need to charge a fair price for your work. And you have to decide what that is for you. And there are a couple of things that I believe very strongly that are important for creative professionals to hold on to. And one of them is that your price is a boundary that you're setting. And if you allow that price to be trampled on, if you allow that price to be messed with, negotiated with, talked down, one of the things that's happening there is that a boundary that you have set for yourself is basically being ignored. And other people are making a decision for you that's really against your will and against your best interest. So one of the things that I really feel strongly about is that we need to work through our pricing, and we need to come up with a way to communicate that price so that it's understandable. This is where I value what I do. And the other story that I'd like to tell is just kind of a preliminary story. Is I took a class with Michael Neal, who's a wonderful coach. I took an online class with him. It's been probably about 5 years ago. And one of the things that was really interesting in that class was we did talk about how to price what we do. And one of the things that was really interesting was that he brought up the idea that most of the time when we price things based on what we think the other person is going to want to spend or what it's worth to the other person. And one of the things that he said in that workshop that has stuck with me is that we should price what we do based on what it's worth to us. And I really liked that story because it's honestly one of the things that we have to stand for is that I have been a creative person for you. I've put my heart, my soul, my investment of time, talent, and energy into this thing. It's been a labor of love, and I want to emphasize that it's been a labor. This has not been easy to do. It has been a labor. There has been a commitment of time and energy and talent. And the value that it has to me is reflected in what I charge for it. So those are the two stories that I wanted to start with. Is that, first of all, we don't want to give away what we do creatively. There are other things that we can give away. We can give away all kinds of stuff, but we don't necessarily need to give away the thing that we charge that is our livelihood. All of that said, I understand the marketplace is a really weird thing right now with all of these online different ways that creative work is kind of, the value of it is being called into question. You know, the Fiverr marketplace is a reality that's here to stay. And you've got people who can go on Fiverr and, bid $5 to do a design job that you would charge $100 for or more. Well, people who are willing to pay $5 for a much more expensive design job probably get what they pay for in the long run. All of that said, let's talk about some misconceptions. When people pay you, we have one misconception that I think is really tied to the industrial model of things, and that is that we're paid for our time. And in the industrial model, you would work a shift, you'd click a time card at the beginning and at the end, and you would be paid for the hours of work that you did. No matter what you did during those hours. It's like if you were, screwing on a widget, you were screwing on a widget. If you were sweeping the floor, you were sweeping the floor. But whatever you did during those hours was what you got paid for. In the creative realm, I don't think that we're being paid for our time, even though a lot of people really get wrapped around the axle around what their hourly rate is. One of the reasons that I don't encourage people to price based on hourly rates is that hourly rates are perceived as negotiable by many people, and they will try to talk you down based on your hourly rate. Yes, you can keep your hourly rate as a part of the equation that you use to determine your price, but don't put it out there that what you were charging for is an hour of your time. The other thing that happens very often with charging with an hourly rate is that people question the amount of time that a project takes. Those of us who are creative know that there are hours when you are actively working on the project, and then there are hours when you're actually doing other things, but you're thinking about the project, and there's ideation that happens when it doesn't look like you're working on the project. So I don't think the hourly rate is necessarily a good reflection of the time that's actually invested. So I don't encourage people to price their creative work on an hourly basis. Yes, include that in the equation, but not strictly. Too many ways that can be misperceived, and too many ways that can be manipulated out of your favor. The second thing that I think is really important is that we have a real sense that we're being paid for qualifications or expertise or knowledge. And I think, again, that is a part of what we're bringing in here. But one of the things that's really interesting is that I've worked with coaches who basically have a high school diploma, and they have years of life experience in entrepreneurship that makes them the right person. So if I was wrapped around the axle about qualifications and about letters behind their name and stuff like that, and saying that I would only pay them because they had a PhD, I think that's the wrong kind of thinking as well. And one of the things that we've got to look at is that expertise, qualifications, and knowledge are also things that sometimes they're really hard to communicate, and they're really also difficult for other people to understand their value. It's like, as a guitar player and as a guitar teacher, I can play a scale for you that I learned in the first week that I was a guitar player, right? I can play the C major scale for you. But the thing that's not communicated there is that I also know all of the different variations of the C major scale, and I know all of the modes that are based on the C major scale, and I know all of the different dyads, triads, chords that can be formed from the C major scale. And I've spent years and years and years understanding the theory of the C major scale, so that when I teach you the C major scale, there's a lot more going into it, but I can't communicate that to you. You're not just paying to learn the C major scale. You're paying for all of that other support that goes into that one little learning, right? So you're not just being paid for your qualifications, your expertise, and your knowledge. It's part of the equation, but it's not the whole thing. And in addition, it's really sometimes hard for other people to understand why that's valuable. Why that all of that goes into what they're getting. They don't get the value of that. Now, here's something that you're going to probably scratch your head about. When all is said and done, you're not actually being paid for your product or your service. Now, that's kind of a scratch your head kind of a statement, but hear me out. When you're being paid for a product or a service, basically what's happening is that you've been able to package value for people, and the value is not necessarily the product or the service, it's something else. But the package is, certainly something that you can ascribe a price to. And very often, I think that's one of the things that people do is they create a package, and they are able to then communicate the value of that package through the price of it. And I'm not opposed to that at all. But when all is said and done, I think there's a misconception that the actual product or service is what's being paid for. And if you'll hear me out, I'll get to why I believe that. But I'd like you to think about when you buy groceries, you might buy a whole bunch of different things. Like you might buy some ground beef and some carrots, some onions, some ketchup, some potatoes, some, garlic, some different kinds of spices, chili powder, things like that. And each one of those things is a separate product. But the thing is like, no one of those things makes the meatloaf. But each one of those is an ingredient in the meatloaf. And I think that that's one of the things that's very often what we're paying for when we buy a product or a service, is that we're actually buying an ingredient for something else. And that's what I'd like to talk about for the rest of the time here. What I believe that you're really being paid for is you're making a desired difference in the quality of a person's life. And that is ultimately what they are paying for. That is the one thing that you can do, that you can communicate the value, is the difference in the quality of life that they are going to make. Your product and your service are an ingredient in that recipe, right? And so, yes, when you buy ingredients, you're buying individual ingredients and you're paying a price for them. But the overall price for what you're doing as a creative, all of these different things that you're bringing to the table are making a desired difference in the quality of life for the person who's on the receiving end. And when we start to talk about that difference, all of a sudden, the conversation about pricing takes on a different tone. And I'll give you an example, going back to the story of the designer that was being asked to give away her work and to be paid a significantly lower hourly rate than what she would normally charge for the design work that she does. I asked this person one question, and that is, when people, after the job is done, what are the people who have your design in their kitchen or in their living room or in their bathroom, what are they going to be talking about with other people? What is their experience going to be? What are the qualities that are being affected by the design that you're bringing into their home? And as we started to talk about the work in those terms, all of a sudden there were a couple of shifts that were really, really remarkable that happened, and I wanted to mention them. And the first shift was, she realized in that moment that one of the big mistakes that she was making in her pricing was she'd been told over and over that she needed to price her work based on what she was worth. And one of the things that was really difficult for her is she's a person who has grown up with mixed messages about her own worth, right? She wasn't very certain of her own worth. And as a result, her pricing, she was willing to settle for a pretty low price when that was the criteria that she was using, right? So one of the things that happened is she was thinking about what the people would, what they would love after the work was done. What would they love about it? What would they talk about? What would they continue to enjoy for years and years and years after the job was done? As she started to talk about that and describe it, all of a sudden, she realized that the price of her work wasn't the work itself. The price of her work was the thing that was going to be enjoyed for years to come after the job was finished. That value automatically was much higher, and it was much easier to communicate, this is what I plan to do for you, and this is what my goal here is for you. I want you to have a kitchen that when people come to visit your home, they leave saying, I want a kitchen like that. When people come to your home, we want them to feel like that they are welcomed and that they are held and that they are enveloped and that they are honored and that they're a cherished guest, and we want the design to do that, right? So as we started to talk about the design in those terms, all of a sudden, there was a huge shift in the way that she perceived the value of her own work. And that shift was able to be carried over into the price of the work, right? And I feel like that's something that we all as creatives need to be thinking about. Now, I learned this lesson for myself the hard way. As a musician, I started as a musician in the late 1970s. And I remember in Wyoming back then, a 17-year-old could play in a bar as long as nobody asked any questions. And you could get paid pretty well. Live music at that time was a great draw for bars and restaurants and clubs and all kinds of social gatherings. So as a musician, there was a lot of opportunity out in the world to make money. And I remember being just excited as a high school student, being paid $150 to play music for a couple of hours. And the thing that was really interesting to me was that I started to have that, kind of union industrial model of, being paid hourly for the work that I did. And I did hourly work as a musician for decades. I would always ask, what's the length of time? How long do you want me to play? How many people is it for? And so I would ask logistical questions like that. But one of the things that was really interesting in the music business is that over the years, the rates didn't go up with the cost of living. In fact, the rates went down. And so I started, as I said, playing in the late 1970s, and I just retired last year. And even last year, the most common rate of pay for a 2-hour gig was somewhere between $100 and $200. So that, the rate of pay for musicians didn't go up hourly with inflation. In fact, it went way, way down. But one of the things that I realized was that I could make more money in tips if I gave people an experience to remember. And so I started to think more about, what are the things that make my music worth paying for? And I started to readjust my own understanding of the value of what I was doing and getting away from the idea that I was just getting up there and playing, singing for 2 hours, and I'd go home with my, $100, $150, tear down my sound system, and maybe, if I got 25 or 30 bucks in tips, that was great. God forbid I would sell a CD, that would be even better. But what was really interesting is that as I started to adopt the idea that what I was providing and what people were paying for was an improvement in their quality of life, I started to think more about what improvement does my music bring to the quality of these people's lives. And that was a really good lesson for me, because at that point my music became less about me and more about that experience for them. And it was really interesting. The thing that happened as I started to really focus on bringing an experience of quality to people, I started to get more tips. Like, my tips exploded. And then another thing started to happen. The people that I was playing for, the venues that I was playing for, started to call me back more frequently, and they started to schedule me more frequently. And as they started to do that, they started to offer me more money for the time that I played. So the very interesting thing was that shift in understanding of that I am being paid for the difference that I'm making in the quality of life. As I started to pay attention to that, all of a sudden, opportunities started to show up that were more lucrative, more enjoyable, and I ended up feeling much more connected to the audience at the end of the night. As I started to explore that in even more detail, some things came to the forefront. And one of the things that really came forward was the idea that the thing that makes the difference in the quality of their life is when my gift is present in the music. Now, I've talked before about the confusion that people have between what's a gift and what's a talent. A talent is something that you do. The gift is the quality that comes through and is delivered through the talent, but it is not the talent itself. And I've done a lot of work in exploring and identifying gifts, not only for myself, but for other people as well. And one of the things that I've always found central to the work that I do with people is that there's a component of it that includes emotional healing and well-being. And there's a component of it that includes just really open self-acceptance and acceptance of others. And so one of the things that I wanted to bring through my music was that sense of feeling better at the end of the night than you felt before. Now, of course, most of the places that I played were breweries and bars and other drinking establishments. So it may be that they were feeling better just because they were loosening up. But one of the things that was really interesting is that I started to just focus on bringing an energy of emotional healing and acceptance into the experience. No matter what songs I was playing, people started to notice, and people started to pay more in tips, and I started to get paid more by the venues, and I started to get booked more by the venues. It was like magic happened, right? So one of the things that I would ask you to consider as you are pricing your work, your creative work, let's get woo-woo with it for a minute and think about what is the gift that is being delivered through the design that you're doing, through the writing that you're doing, through the editing that you're doing, through the painting that you're doing, through the business that you're creating. What is being delivered in terms of the gift that affects the quality of the person's life on the other end? And let's start to talk about how valuable that is. That's not worth giving away. That is something that people will gladly pay for because they understand and they experience the value on the other end. Let's get away from the idea that creative work is a commodity that can be negotiated. And let's get back to the idea that creative work is here with the intent of delivering a desired difference in the quality of life for the people who buy it. If you want to know what I think you're really being paid for, that's it. You're making a desired difference in the quality of life for the people who your products and your services and your inspiration reach. I'm going to end there, but I think this is just the beginning of the discussion. If any of you would be interested in having a discussion about pricing, I would love to host a forum about that. If you're interested in that kind of a discussion, would you please get in touch with me at franklin@franklintaggart.com, and we will set up that kind of an event. As always, folks, I appreciate your time and your attention, your most precious commodities. I'll be back with another interview next week on Your Own Best Company. But these solo shows are things that I've wanted to do for a long time, and just went ahead and decided to put one together for today. But I do appreciate it when you listen, when you subscribe, when you review and share Your Own Best Company with the people who you think will appreciate it. Thank you again, and I'll be back with you next time. So long. Thanks for listening to Your Own Best Company.
If you enjoyed the show, would you do me a favor and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast host? If you really love it, leave me a review or share it with your circles. If you feel like your career is reaching a dead end, or you're feeling a deep sense of dissatisfaction in your work right now, I help people discover their gifts and then find or create new opportunities that are the best fit for their talent, experience, and lifestyle. Email me at coaching@franklintaggart.com for more information. I also help people start, finish, and launch creative projects, and I offer an ongoing marketing mastermind for solopreneurs and freelancers. More information on these programs and services can be found at franklintaggart.com. Thanks again for spending this time with me.